When people hear the name Sparta, they imagine a city frozen in eternal war, a place where shields never rested, where spears were always raised, and where every heartbeat sounded like a marching drum. But that image, as powerful and cinematic as it is, hides something far more unsettling. Because Sparta was not always at war, and the Sparta that lived in peace was not the same Sparta that marched to battle. Most histories begin with the clash of shields, with Thermopylae, with blood and sacrifice, because violence is easier to remember than silence. And yet the real story of Sparta begins not on the battlefield, but in the long stretches of uneasy calm between wars, where the city held its breath, watching, waiting, calculating. Peace in Sparta was not gentle, it was tense. It was quiet in a way that made people listen to every sound, measure every movement, and wonder how long the silence would last. In times of peace, Sparta did not celebrate. It prepared. The streets were not filled with victory songs, but with routine, repetition, and control, because Spartans understood something terrifyingly well, that peace was temporary and war was inevitable. So even when swords were sheathed, fear was not. This is where the myth begins to crack, because the Sparta of peace was a city of families, of mothers managing estates, of children growing under discipline rather than violence, of elders enforcing order with rules instead of weapons. And this version of Sparta rarely appears in films, books, or popular imagination. Why? Because it is harder to dramatize restraint than chaos. Now imagine the moment when peace ends, not with a gradual shift, but with a single decision, a single message, a single order that transforms the entire city overnight. Homes empty, voices fall silent, and Sparta becomes something else entirely. The same streets, the same walls, the same people, but a different reality. This is the Sparta most people recognize, the Sparta of war, a city where individual identity dissolves, where men stop being sons and husbands and become units, where mothers are expected to swallow fear, where silence becomes a duty, and where failure does not belong to one man, but threatens the survival of all. Here is the question no one asks. How can one society live in these two states, peace and war, without tearing itself apart? How do you raise children in calm, knowing you may soon send them into chaos? How do you build families in a world that expects sacrifice as a norm? And how do you return to peace after war has reshaped everything? Sparta's greatest strength was not its army, it was its ability to switch, to turn peace into preparation and preparation into survival. But that strength came with a cost, because every transition hardened the city a little more. Every war shortened its future. This video is not about whether Sparta was cruel. That question is too simple. This video is about how living between peace and war reshaped an entire society, how the same rules that created discipline in peace became suffocating in war, and how a city designed to survive conflict eventually struggled to survive itself. So before we talk about battles, tactics, or legends, we must first understand this. Sparta was not a single idea. It was a balance, fragile, tense, and constantly under threat. And once that balance was lost, no amount of discipline could save it. When people imagine Sparta, they imagine motion, marching feet, clashing shields, shouted commands. Yet the reality is that Sparta spent far more time not fighting than fighting, and it was in these long, uneasy periods of peace that the true nature of the city revealed itself most clearly. Peace in Sparta was not a reward. It was not celebration. It was not relief. Peace was a holding pattern. In times without war, Sparta did not relax its grip on its people. Instead, it tightened it quietly, carefully, almost invisibly, because the Spartans understood something that most societies preferred to ignore. Peace was temporary, fragile, and dangerous if misunderstood. While other Greek cities used peace to trade, debate, and experiment, Sparta used peace to prepare, to discipline, and to control, turning everyday life into a slow rehearsal for a future conflict that everyone knew would eventually arrive. The streets of Sparta in peacetime were calm, but never carefree. There were no bustling markets filled with luxury, no loud public celebrations, no monuments to excess wealth, because prosperity was viewed with suspicion, and comfort was seen as a weakness that softened the mind long before it softened the body. Sparta chose simplicity not because it was poor, but because it was afraid of what comfort could do. At the center of this peaceful order stood Spartan women. While men trained and drilled, women managed land, controlled estates, supervised labor, and ensured that food production never failed, making them the economic backbone of the city during peace. Not symbols, not background figures, but active participants in the survival of the state. Peace revealed a truth often ignored. Sparta did not function because of warriors alone. It functioned because women kept it alive. Children in peaceful Sparta did not grow up surrounded by violence, but they also did not grow up sheltered. From an early age, discipline shaped their routines, their speech, and even their silence. Because peace was the time when habits were formed, when endurance was trained slowly, deliberately, without urgency, like a blade sharpened over years rather than minutes. There was no rush. War would come. Spartan boys trained, but they did not fight. Spartan girls exercised, but not for battle, for strength, health, and the expectation that they would one day bear children capable of surviving a harsh world, a belief that tied physical fitness directly to the future of the state. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was fear disguised as structure. Even in peace, Sparta lived under constant tension because of the helot population, the enslaved laborers who outnumbered Spartan citizens and represented an ever-present threat of rebellion, turning peace into a delicate balancing act where calm had to be enforced without ever appearing weak. There was always watching, always listening, always suspicion. Elders held power during peace, not generals, not heroes, but old men who understood that order mattered more than glory and who governed through tradition, ritual, and precedent, ensuring that change happened slowly, if at all, because change was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Peace was conservative, deliberately so. What made Spartan peace truly unsettling was that it never allowed people to forget war. Stories were told, songs were sung, examples were repeated. Peace was filled with reminders of past sacrifices and future expectations, creating a culture where calm moments were always haunted by what might come next. This was psychological discipline, not physical, and it was just as effective. Spartan mothers during peace lived in a state of quiet anticipation. They raised children knowing that calm years were borrowed time, knowing that sons trained in peace might one day march away and never return, and that daughters would inherit not only land, but the burden of maintaining a society built on endurance rather than happiness. Love existed, but it was careful, measured, contained. Peace also exposed Sparta's greatest weakness, because while peace allowed preparation, it also allowed numbers to shrink, traditions to harden, and flexibility to disappear, slowly turning a once adaptive system into a rigid machine that struggled to respond to change. What worked perfectly in controlled calm became suffocating over time. In peace, Sparta looked stable, but stability was deceptive. Underneath the order was stagnation. Underneath the discipline was fear of change. And underneath the calm was a city quietly exhausting itself by refusing to evolve. Sparta's peace was not gentle, but it was effective for a time. It created unity. It created discipline. It created purpose. But it also created limits. Because a society that lives forever preparing for war eventually forgets how to live for anything else. This is the Sparta that rarely appears in stories. Not the battlefield legend, but the silent city standing still, watching the horizon, measuring time not in years but in the space between wars, hoping that preparation would always be enough. And eventually learning that preparation alone cannot save a society from itself. When war finally came to Sparta, it did not arrive as a sudden explosion of chaos, but as a cold, disciplined transformation, where a society that had spent years preparing in silence crossed an invisible threshold and accepted that, from this moment forward, every breath, every movement, and every decision would belong not to the individual, but to the state. There were no speeches meant to inspire courage, because courage was assumed, and there were no promises of glory, because Spartans understood that war was not a stage for honor, but a test of whether their way of life could survive contact with reality. The moment war was declared, Sparta stopped functioning as a community and began functioning as a mechanism, one where families were separated without ceremony, where private emotions were pushed aside, and where men who had known each other since childhood now stood shoulder to shoulder, stripped of personal identity, bound together by formation, discipline, and the shared understanding that hesitation was more dangerous than fear. War did not allow time to think. Thinking slowed reaction, and slow reaction meant death. Spartan soldiers in war were not fearless, despite what legends suggest, because fear was inevitable, but fear was not allowed to surface. Not because it was shameful, but because it was contagious, and in a tightly packed formation where survival depended on unity, a single moment of visible panic could unravel the entire line and doom everyone behind it. Courage in Sparta was not emotional, it was mechanical. As men marched outward, the city itself turned inward, and Spartan women entered a different kind of battlefield, one defined by waiting, uncertainty, and enforced silence, because they understood that public grief weakened resolve, that visible despair invited doubt, and that their role in war was not to question its cost, but to absorb it without breaking. This expectation did not make them unfeeling. It made them exhausted. War altered the rhythm of daily life so completely that even victory felt hollow, because every battle reduced the number of men who could return, every casualty shrank the next generation, and every campaign forced Sparta to confront a truth it feared most, that its population was finite, replaceable only over decades, and incapable of sustaining endless loss. Sparta could afford discipline. It could not afford attrition. Unlike societies that could absorb defeat through numbers, wealth, or territory, Sparta's strength rested on a narrow base, where each fallen soldier represented not only a life lost, but a future denied, a family line ended, and a small but irreversible weakening of the entire system. War did not just kill men, it erased possibilities. Over time, the discipline that once held Sparta together hardened into rigidity, because war rewarded obedience and punished deviation, slowly teaching the city that flexibility was dangerous and adaptation was risky, until even peace began to feel unsafe, and every compromise felt like a step toward collapse. Sparta became trapped inside its own survival instincts. Prolonged warfare did something even more destructive. It normalized emergency. What was once an exception became routine. What was once sacrifice became expectation. And what was once unity slowly turned into pressure as fewer men were asked to carry the same burden again and again, with no space left for recovery, renewal, or reform. This is where the myth of Spartan invincibility finally breaks, because a society built entirely for war can survive short conflicts, but it cannot survive endless ones. And as wars accumulated, Sparta found itself unable to return fully to peace and increasingly incapable of sustaining war. Caught between two states that demanded opposite things. Sparta did not fall because it lost its discipline, nor because its soldiers lacked courage, but because war consumed the very resource that discipline could not replace: people. And once that resource was gone, no amount of training, tradition, or fear could restore what had been lost. The machine kept moving, but it was running out of parts. Sparta in war was terrifyingly effective, but effectiveness came at a cost that grew heavier with every campaign, until eventually the balance that once defined Spartan survival collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind not a sudden defeat, but a slow erosion of strength, relevance, and resilience. Sparta did not die in a single battle. It faded, and it faded because war, the very thing it was designed to master, became permanent. When we separate Sparta into peace and war, it is easy to believe that we are looking at two different cities, two different moral systems, even two different identities. Yet beneath these shifting conditions existed a core that never truly changed, a foundation so deeply embedded in Spartan life that it shaped every decision, whether the city was quiet or under attack. That constant was control. In peace, control appeared as routine, tradition, and restraint. Where daily life followed strict patterns, emotions were measured and deviation was quietly discouraged. While in war, that same control hardened into obedience, silence, and absolute discipline, proving that Sparta did not invent new values for conflict, but simply intensified the ones it already lived by. Peace and war were not opposites in Sparta. They were different expressions of the same system. Another unchanging element was the subordination of the individual to the collective, because whether a Spartan was managing land during peace or standing in formation during war, personal desire, comfort, and fear were always secondary to what the state required, creating a society where identity was defined less by who you were and more by how well you fit your assigned role. In peace, this meant accepting simplicity. In war, it meant accepting sacrifice. But acceptance itself was constant. Fear was also a permanent presence, though it changed its shape. In peace, fear lived quietly in the background, in the awareness of Helot revolts, population decline, and future invasions. While in war, fear became immediate and physical, tied to death, loss, and irreversible consequences. Yet in both states, fear was not denied or eliminated, but managed, disciplined, and absorbed into behavior. Spartans did not claim to be fearless. They claimed to be controlled. The role of women offers one of the clearest examples of continuity because Spartan mothers carried responsibility in both peace and war, managing households, land, and labor during calm periods, and maintaining emotional stability, silence, and morale during conflict, demonstrating that their importance did not increase or decrease with war, but simply shifted in expression. Their burden never disappeared. It only changed form. Children too experienced this continuity as peace was the period of preparation and war, the period of consequence. But both were guided by the same expectation: endurance, obedience, and contribution to the state, ensuring that upbringing was never separate from politics and childhood was never free from societal pressure. Sparta did not have a civilian life separate from its military life. It had one life, viewed through different conditions. Perhaps the most overlooked constant was the absence of celebration, because Sparta did not celebrate peace with excess, nor did it celebrate war with glory, treating both states with seriousness and restraint, a reflection of a culture that mistrusted emotion when it became public and dangerous. Joy was private, duty was public. Even decline followed this pattern of continuity, as the same rigidity that provided stability in peace and cohesion in war eventually limited adaptation in both, showing that the traits that once protected Sparta also trapped it. Regardless of circumstance, peace could not soften the system. War could not replace what was lost. The core remained unchanged even as conditions shifted. This is why understanding Sparta requires looking not at its battles or its calm moments in isolation, but at the values that persisted through both. Because Sparta was not a city that alternated between peace and war, but a society that lived permanently preparing, permanently controlling, and permanently sacrificing flexibility for survival. The setting changed, the pressure changed, but the structure did not. In the end, Sparta's greatest strength and greatest weakness were the same, because the qualities that allowed it to endure both peace and war for centuries also prevented it from evolving beyond them, leaving behind a legacy not of constant violence, but of constant tension. Sparta did not break because it could not handle war. It struggled because it never truly learned how to live differently in peace.